before a single bomb ever tore through London's streets. The city was already under threat in a way most people never think about. The danger didn't begin with the scream of sirens or the glow of fires in the night sky. It began quietly, invisibly, in radio waves moving through the air. Messages sent in short bursts, encoded in symbols that looked meaningless to anyone listening in. While Londoners went about their lives, Hitler's air force was planning devastation with frightening precision. Guided by information Britain simply could not see. The Luftwaffe's real strength wasn't just its aircraft or its pilots. It was coordination. Every bombing raid, every shift in strategy, every change in target depended on constant communication between German command centers and the planes in the sky. These messages were protected by Enigma, a machine the Germans believed made their communications mathematically unbreakable. To them, it was a lock with millions of combinations, changing every single day. Even if an enemy somehow cracked today's settings, tomorrow the door would slam shut again. From the German perspective, it meant freedom to plan in plain sight. For Britain, it meant blindness. Radar could show incoming aircraft, but radar couldn't explain intent. It couldn't tell whether the next wave of bombers was heading for factories, ports, airfields, or civilian neighborhoods. Without understanding the enemy's plans, British defenses were always reacting instead of preparing. Fighter squadrons were scrambled too late. Anti-aircraft guns were often aimed at the wrong altitudes. Precious resources were spread thin across the country because no one knew where the real blow would fall. This uncertainty created a constant psychological pressure. Imagine defending a city when you don't know where the next punch is coming from, or when. Every night could be the night the heart of London was destroyed. Every morning brought new decisions made with incomplete information. The government had to balance protecting civilians, preserving industry, and keeping the Royal Air Force alive, all while guessing what the Luftwaffe would do next. Guessing, in war, is another word for losing. What made this even more dangerous was how confident Germany was in its advantage. The Luftwaffe planned operations assuming their messages were secure. They discussed routes, timing, weather conditions, and even weaknesses in British defenses over encrypted radio. This wasn't reckless behavior. It was calculated arrogance, built on faith in mathematics and machinery. As far as German commanders were concerned, no enemy could possibly read their thoughts. Meanwhile, in London, the threat felt both distant and immediate at the same time. People could sense that something terrible was coming. But they didn't understand how deeply stacked the odds were against them. Britain wasn't just outnumbered in the air. It was outinformed. War isn't only about firepower. It's about knowing more than your enemy, faster than your enemy. In that crucial area, Germany held the upper hand. The terrifying truth is that even bravery and resilience couldn't fix this problem. Courage doesn't decode messages. Determination doesn't reveal enemy plans. Britain could build more planes, train more pilots, and dig more shelters, but without insight into German intentions, every move was reactive. London's fate depended on something far removed from dogfights and bomb shelters. It depended on breaking into the enemy's mind. At this stage, almost everyone believed it couldn't be done. Enigma had been examined by experts and dismissed as too complex. The idea that someone could crack it seemed closer to fantasy than strategy. And yet, if the code remained sealed, the Luftwaffe would continue striking with near-perfect coordination. London wouldn't just be bombed. It would be systematically dismantled. Night after night, guided by messages no one on the British side could read. This was the invisible battlefield, where no shots were fired but everything was at stake. A war fought not in the skies over England, but in the space between symbols and logic. And while Britain struggled in the dark, believing itself one step behind an unstoppable enemy, the key to survival was already beginning to take shape. Far from London, in the mind of someone the Nazis never considered a threat, while Britain was still struggling to understand how blind it truly was, Something extraordinary had already happened beyond its borders. The idea that Enigma was unbreakable wasn't just German propaganda. It was widely accepted by cryptographers across Europe. The machine relied on rotors, plugboards, and constantly changing settings that created an astronomical number of possible combinations. To most experts, trying to break it felt like trying to count every grain of sand on a beach while the tide kept rearranging them. And yet, one man looked at the problem and saw not chaos but structure. He wasn't a spy in a trench coat or a military officer issuing commands. He was a young Polish mathematician trained to think in abstractions, in patterns that existed beneath the surface. Where others saw Enigma as a mechanical puzzle, he saw it as a mathematical system. One that had rules, limitations, and, crucially, weaknesses. Germany underestimated him completely. Not because of who he was, but because of what he represented. A civilian mind operating outside traditional intelligence thinking. Working in Poland in the early 1930s, he and a small team were tasked with studying intercepted German radio traffic. They didn't have the luxury of captured Enigma machines or detailed technical manuals. Instead, they had fragments, snippets of encrypted messages, educated guesses about German procedures, and a deep understanding of mathematics. Rather than trying to guess passwords or phrases, he approached the problem by reconstructing the machine itself on paper, mapping how electrical signals moved through its rotors. This shift in thinking changed everything. Instead of fighting Enigma head-on, he began to box it in logically. He recognized that human operators, even disciplined German ones, introduced predictability into the system. Procedures were followed. Habits formed. Certain message formats repeated themselves day after day. These weren't mistakes in the traditional sense. They were structural fingerprints. And mathematics is exceptionally good at recognizing fingerprints. Against staggering odds, he succeeded in doing what Germany believed was impossible. He reconstructed the internal wiring of Enigma without ever physically seeing the machine. It was an intellectual breakthrough so precise that it bordered on unbelievable. With this knowledge, he didn't just crack individual messages. He broke the logic of the system itself. For the first time, Enigma wasn't a mystical black box. It was something that could be understood, analyzed, and attacked. But this victory didn't happen in isolation. Time was running out. Poland sat directly in the path of German expansion. And its intelligence services knew they wouldn't be able to hold forever. As the threat of invasion grew, the Polish team made a decision that would change the course of history. Instead of guarding their breakthrough as a national secret, they shared it. They passed their methods, insights, and even physical replicas of Enigma to British and French intelligence. This moment is often overlooked, but it was pivotal. Britain's later success at Bletchley Park didn't begin from scratch. It began with a foundation built by a mathematician who had already done the hardest part, proving that Enigma could be broken at all. Without that proof, without that mathematical roadmap, British codebreakers might never have been given the confidence or resources to pursue the problem aggressively. What makes this story even more remarkable is how invisible this man remained. He didn't seek recognition. He didn't command armies or appear in propaganda films. His weapon was quiet thought, applied relentlessly and patiently. While Germany invested in machines and power, he invested in understanding. And understanding, it turns out, was the more dangerous force. In a war defined by explosions and mass destruction, his contribution happened entirely in silence. No alarms sounded when he cracked Enigma. No one cheered. But with that single intellectual act, the balance of the war subtly began to tilt. The Luftwaffe still believed it was speaking in secret. Britain still appeared to be guessing. But beneath the surface, the rules had changed. The Nazis never realized that one of their greatest advantages had already been compromised by someone they didn't even know existed. And as Europe moved closer to all-out war, That overlooked Polish mathematician had already placed the first crack in the armor of Hitler's Air Force. A crack that would soon widen into something catastrophic for Germany. Once the logic of Enigma had been exposed, the war in the air began to change in ways that were almost impossible to see from the ground. To the average Londoner, the Battle of Britain looked like a desperate, heroic stand against overwhelming odds. Fighter pilots scrambling at the last second, anti-aircraft fire lighting up the sky, and entire neighborhoods bracing for impact. What no one could see was that the chaos had begun to organize itself behind the scenes. The Luftwaffe still believed it was operating in total secrecy, but its most important advantage was slipping away. Intercepted German messages were no longer just noise. They became warnings. British intelligence could now read details about planned air raids, when they would happen, which routes the bombers would take, how many aircraft were involved, and sometimes even which targets were considered most important. This didn't mean Britain suddenly knew everything, or that every message was cracked instantly. But it meant the fog of war began to lift just enough to make informed decisions instead of blind guesses. That shift was enormous. Instead of keeping fighter squadrons scattered across the country, commanders could concentrate their forces where they were actually needed. Pilots no longer had to burn fuel endlessly patrolling empty skies. They could be rested, briefed, and launched at the precise moment interception would be most effective. Even a small timing advantage in aerial combat could mean the difference between stopping a bombing raid and watching it pass through untouched. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, started to feel something was wrong. Missions that should have caught British fighters off guard were suddenly met with organized resistance. Bombers encountered defenders already climbing to the right altitude, already positioned along expected flight paths. To German crews, it felt like bad luck or uncanny coincidence. From the British side, it was preparation quietly replacing desperation. This hidden advantage also allowed Britain to make strategic choices that looked almost reckless on the surface. There were moments when incoming raids were allowed to pass without interception. Not because Britain couldn't respond, but because commanders knew those attacks weren't aimed at critical targets. Instead, resources were conserved for more dangerous strikes planned for later. To the enemy, it looked like weakness. In reality, it was discipline powered by information. Perhaps most importantly, the code-breaking effort helped preserve the Royal Air Force itself. Germany's strategy depended on destroying British fighters faster than they could be replaced. Every unnecessary dogfight weakened Britain's ability to defend its skies. By knowing where and when to engage, Britain avoided being drawn into battles designed to exhaust its pilots and machines. Survival wasn't about winning every fight. It was about choosing the right ones. As weeks passed, the Luftwaffe's confidence began to erode. Their planning grew more erratic. Targets shifted. Tactics changed. But none of these adjustments fixed the core problem. Their communications were no longer private. Every new plan was built on the false assumption that Britain remained blind. That assumption cost Germany time, aircraft, and experienced crews it could not afford to lose. From the outside, the outcome of the Battle of Britain has often been credited to bravery alone. And bravery mattered immensely. But courage without coordination would not have been enough. The reason Britain could hold on night after night was because it had quietly gained the ability to anticipate the enemy rather than simply endure him. The Luftwaffe was fighting a war it believed it controlled, while Britain was fighting one it increasingly understood. This change didn't just protect cities. It reshaped the trajectory of the war. By preventing Germany from achieving air superiority, Britain denied Hitler the conditions needed for invasion. Operation Sea Lion, the planned assault on the British mainland, remained an idea on paper rather than a reality on the beaches. And that delay, caused in large part by compromised communications, gave the Allies something priceless: time. Time to rebuild, time to adapt, and time for the United States to eventually enter the war. All of it hinged on the fact that German air power had been subtly undermined by Mathematician. Patience. The Luftwaffe still had planes. It still had pilots. What it no longer had was certainty. And in modern warfare, uncertainty is fatal. The code that once protected Hitler's air force had become a silent liability, turning precision into guesswork. Without realizing it, the Luftwaffe was flying into traps laid not by weapons but by knowledge. When the war finally ended and the world began to tell the story of how Hitler was defeated, the spotlight fell almost everywhere except where it truly belonged. History celebrated generals, machines, and massive battles. The narrative was filled with tanks rolling across Europe, bombers darkening the skies, and speeches that rallied nations. But the quiet victory that made many of those moments possible remained classified, hidden behind layers of secrecy that lasted for decades. And at the center of that silence was the man whose ideas helped save London long before the first bombs fell. The Polish mathematician who cracked Enigma didn't return home to applause. In fact, he couldn't return home at all. Post-war Poland fell under Soviet influence, and his wartime contributions, especially those shared with Western intelligence, made his situation complicated and dangerous. He lived much of his life in obscurity, working ordinary jobs, rarely speaking about what he had done. While others were hailed as heroes, he became a footnote if he was mentioned at all. Part of this erasure was intentional. Britain kept the secret of code-breaking tightly sealed, fearing that revealing it would expose ongoing intelligence capabilities. Even the veterans who worked at Bletchley Park were ordered never to speak about their roles. As a result, the public story of the war became incomplete. The miracles of foresight, the uncanny anticipation of enemy moves, and the sudden shifts in fortune were explained away as luck or superior leadership. But luck doesn't consistently predict enemy plans. And leadership alone doesn't make an opponent repeat the same mistakes. What really happened was far more fragile and far more human. It was the result of one mind recognizing that a supposedly perfect system wasn't perfect at all. A single breakthrough, shared at the right moment, created a chain reaction that influenced everything from air defense to the timing of major operations. Without that early Polish contribution, Britain's later code-breaking efforts might never have reached the scale they did. Bletchley Park may not have existed in the same form. The machines built to automate decryption might not have been funded. The confidence to pursue Enigma relentlessly might never have taken hold. And without that momentum, the Luftwaffe's advantage could have lasted just long enough to change history completely. It's uncomfortable to think about how narrow that margin was. London's survival wasn't guaranteed. It wasn't inevitable. It rested on decisions made in rooms with chalkboards, papers covered in symbols, and people who never fired a shot. Millions of lives were affected by work that produced no explosions and left no visible scars. That kind of impact is easy to overlook, but impossible to deny once you understand it. Only decades later, when files were declassified and survivors began to speak, did the full picture start to emerge. The world slowly learned that the Allied victory wasn't just a triumph of industrial power or military might. It was also a triumph of intellect and cooperation across borders. A Polish mathematician's decision to share his work, rather than protect it as a national secret, became one of the most consequential acts of the entire war. His story forces us to rethink what heroism really looks like. It isn't always loud. It doesn't always come with medals or monuments. Sometimes it looks like patience, curiosity, and the willingness to believe that a problem everyone else has given up on can still be solved. The Nazis built their confidence on complexity and fear. He dismantled it with logic. Today, we live in a world shaped by codes, encryption, and invisible systems that quietly govern everything from finance to communication. The idea that one person's understanding of those systems can change the course of history is more relevant than ever. The man who helped save London reminds us that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, it works silently, altering outcomes before anyone realizes a battle has even begun. He may not have wanted recognition, but recognition matters. Not for ego, but for truth. Because when we forget stories like his, we misunderstand how the world really works. London didn't survive solely because of courage in the skies. It survived because someone, years earlier and far away, chose to challenge the impossible. And in doing so, he left a mark on history that no bomb ever could.